Recording in 3, 2, 1. Everybody, welcome back. I'm Susan Lindner, your host of the Innovation Storytellers Show. We're here to discuss the stories that make innovations happen. So I'm really excited for my guest today. Full confession, I am not a Scotch and whiskey drinker, but I'm very glad that my guest is here to educate me and all of you on what it means to think about spirits in an innovative way, of what it means to look at things like machine learning, our historical background, and how we bring that into innovation, how we begin to mark out new territory and even look out new markets, of how we begin to think about taking something that is ancient and making it new and relevant, and perhaps even a new North Star or a guiding star of how we think about innovating things that have been with us really since humanitarians' time immemorial, right? Humans' time immemorial. So let me introduce you to my guest. Aimée Morrison is a master blender at Diageo. That is the $803 billion brand behind Johnnie Walker, Guinness, Smirnoff, and so many more. Aimée is a leading figure in the male-dominated whiskey industry and one of just a handful of female scientists pioneering the use of machine algorithms in the food and beverage space. And we are going to get so much more into your background. Aimée, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hello, nice to be with you. Thank you for inviting me on the show.
So first, tell us a little bit about about your background, and then we're going to get into the lovely background behind you, that is Portel. So I always ask my guests, how did you come to this place of innovation? And it turns out nobody walks in through the front door of innovation. We all have different means of getting there, but you come as a chemist to this place, correct?
That's absolutely right. And I guess that's actually where my journey began with the Scotch whisky industry. I was really fortunate that I did a master's in chemistry, and the last year of my university course was actually a student placement. And that placement was with Diageo in the whiskey specialist team. And that was really my first introduction to the world of whiskey. And that's where my journey began within whiskey.
As a humble intern.
Absolutely. It's one of the best places to start, I think. Well, from my opinion, one of the best places to start.
Agreed.
And it really was the beginning of my journey. I think it's safe to say that I fell in love with the world of whiskey, the world of flavor, the world of analytical science, and how that can be used within the world of whiskey. And my journey went from there. So this was the last year of my university placement. And because that was the year that I graduated, it meant that once I'd finished university, I was able to stay on with the company. And luckily enough, from my perspective, they wanted to keep me on. So when I graduated, I actually had a couple of different roles within Diageo. I worked in analysis for a little while, so I was able to develop my analytical skills and, I guess, understand a bit more around the world of analysis. And I also worked in liquid science for a little while as well. And that was really where I started to develop my project management skills and understanding how different flavors can be integrated when we're talking about anything that isn't whiskey. So definitely expanding my whiskey knowledge at that stage. But I guess I knew in my heart of hearts that whiskey was really what I wanted to come back to if I was able to. And luckily enough, a position became available back in the whiskey specialist team. I applied, and the rest is history. And I've been back in the team for, gosh, it must be 9 years now as a whiskey blender. So that's 10 years worth of experience in the whiskey specialist team, working alongside a wonderful team of a relatively small team. So there's 12 of us in the whiskey team in total, but we look after and are responsible for the quality and the innovation coming out of all of the whiskies for Diageo.
Wow. And how many are we talking about now when you count all of them by bottle? What would you say by brand?
Oh gosh, I wouldn't like to hazard a guess as to how many products that we have out there now, but 29 different distilleries that are under our ownership, and we are responsible for the quality and making sure that we understand how the whiskies are maturing that are within all of these distilleries, so that ultimately when we come to create the products that currently exist, they are of the perfect quality that we and the consumers would be expecting. And then we understand how they are for us to be able to do innovations with those whiskies as well.
Well, you've just hit on my favorite word, obviously. the innovation side of the house. Let's take a step back, because first off, the idea of innovating something that is so central to people's noses and tastes, right? People who have this sense of this is what it should taste like, right?
Mhm.
And we know almost instantly, right, when we're served a well quality spirit versus the brand name spirit that we've become accustomed to. We know it almost instantly, right? We have almost a muscle memory around that. Let's talk about the process of innovating. And you're seated in front of Portel in this beautiful background behind you, but taking something so old, right? So a very ancient kind of spirit, ancient, we're talking from the 1800s, right? And really beginning to rethink it. How does that process begin?
It's quite a complex process, which I guess you've just alluded to. But we draw on the wealth of experience and knowledge and technical understanding that all of the members of the whisky team have. And it's all of that coming together. And we work with lots of different teams as well, be it our brand teams, whether that's technical, malt distilling. Lots of different people are at play for us to be able to create these innovations. But ultimately, when we're working in the lab, if we're creating a new recipe for a new product, say we're talking about Portel, for example, say it's a whiskey very close to my heart, particularly at the moment, what we would do, we would have an idea of the flavour profile that we're looking to create for a new whiskey. And we would use our understanding, our expertise, our knowledge of the stock, the inventory that we have, and we would request different cask samples to be taken and sent back to the lab for us to be able to assess. And from that assessment, what we're looking for is to understand the organoleptic qualities that these whiskies have. We put them out for assessment around 23% by nose. That helps to release a lot of volatile flavour aromas that are within the whiskey. And then we assess them cask by cask so that we understand the individualities and the different profiles that each of these whiskies have, because each whiskey is unique at the end of the day. Each whiskey has its own story to be able to tell, particularly at the ages that we're talking about with the old Portel stocks that we have in the inventory. So we understand everything that we can around these whiskies of the glasses in front of us. And then we start to build recipes. We start to bring together whiskies that have a very similar flavour profile and create what we call kind of components to work with. And then we start to build the recipes from these components to see how introducing 1 + 1 doesn't always equal 2 in the world of whiskey. Sometimes it equals 5. And that's part of the journey of creation. It's what makes it really exciting for us as whiskey blenders. Because every time that you're creating a new whiskey, you're learning something about the whiskies that you're working with too. And we keep doing that. It's quite an iterative process. And I guess that's where my chemistry background and knowledge starts to come into play a little bit more as well. It affects how I'm blending in the lab because it is an iterative process. And I like to understand how small changes, the impact that those small changes have on the whiskies in front of us. And we keep doing that process until we feel that we've landed the flavour style that is perfect for the concept that we were originally working on. And then we'll share it with the team to make sure that they all feel similarly. And that's where the power of a team really comes into play as well. Because as you alluded to, sensory it's almost tangible to memories. Everybody has their own feelings when it comes to sensory. You might describe something as orchard fruits, as appley. I might describe it as fresh and vibrant and crisp green apple. Ultimately, we both mean exactly the same thing, but we need to understand where we're both coming from. And when we use those terms, actually, we realize that we're using the same terminology to describe the same flavor.
Yeah. Yeah. A friend of mine, her mom was a chocolate tester at
Ooh.
Aimée Morrison. And so her task with 7 other people, you had to have an odd number of people on the team at Mars,
Mhm.
was tasting different kinds of chocolate. And we were at a party and I said, help me understand how to taste it because I didn't know how to do it. And she said, first start with a plastic spoon. She said, the metal will alter your sensation of the chocolate in your mouth. The temperature of the metal will change the size of the taste buds on your tongue. And she said, now put it in your mouth and see what that initial feeling is. And then we're going to begin to taste for stickiness to the teeth, viscosity on the tongue, how quickly the chocolate moves from the front of your teeth to the back of the mouth. how the consistency of vanilla or coffee notes or bitter notes or sweet notes, even salt. And so that was endless times per day over and over again until everyone had reached consensus that the taste was the taste that they could all agree upon.
Oh,
And
sounds interesting.
it was fascinating. I never ate a brownie the same way ever again. I can do that for sure. And I always eat chocolate ice. I always eat ice cream now with a plastic spoon instead of a metal one. And I by the way, turn the ice cream down on your tongue, not the bottom of the spoon on your tongue, but the ice cream so that you get the ice cream flavor first, not the spoon. So this is just one tiny little window, but I imagine the complexity around the flavor of whiskeys is at a whole different level than chocolate ice cream, frankly. So
It's huge,
yeah,
absolutely.
even
And
that description you just offered of a green apple versus an autumn apple, right? It's worlds apart. As a pie baker, I'm very specific about what I'm putting in my pie. But I mean, getting to consensus around that, what kind of apple, right, is a big deal.
it sure is. And we have different tools that are available to us to help us along that journey and to help people that maybe don't have, so people outside of the whiskey team that maybe don't have that level of understanding when we're talking about these words, this terminology. So we have flavor wheels that we will refer to help, I guess, to help people understand where these flavors arise from. So we'll start with the cardinal flavors within the center of the flavor wheel. And then
What are
as you
those?
start to so these are the 6 main flavour camps that most of our flavours we feel originate from. So fruity, spicy, woody are examples of those. And they come from different origins. So whether that's from the distillery character or whether that's from the maturation impact when these whiskies are maturing in oak cask. And from those oak casks, those casks can have lots of different treatments as well. So we start with the cardinal flavors, and then as we work out in the flavor wheel, the descriptors become a bit more expansive, and you can start to understand and tease out where these different flavors really come from and use more expansive language.
I just love this because like it's helping me understand flavor almost like an artist would understand a color palette. So we might start with primary colors and then work our way out to secondary colors, right? And then the pastels and all the variations thereof. And as an innovator, it's also giving you this opportunity to figure out in which direction you want to go. You can move the levers of these flavors based on something that you started off with concept. And so, just to be a little bit more esoteric, if you don't mind going down this path a little bit, like, how do you start off with when you're thinking about innovating, right? Creating a new product, you start with a new concept. So, what does the concept of a whiskey sound like?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. So I guess as a whiskey blender, our starting point is what flavor profile are we hoping to achieve at the end of the day? What do we want this whiskey to taste like? But it's not just what do we want it to taste like neat. Is there a particular occasion that we wish for this whiskey to be tasted in? Is there a particular serve that we wish this whiskey to be served with? And they kind of come.
Is that a food compliment when you say served with, or is that something else?
Potentially, so it could be a food pairing, or it could be a particular type of serve, such as on the rocks with ice, or in a particular cocktail serve, for example, or alongside cold water is another example too. So it's really the three of those things coming together for us. But then there's other things like the more technical side, the strength that we want the whiskey to be, the occasion, is it after lunch, is it an evening kind of whiskey? All of those can start to have a temporal effect as to the types of flavors that we might wish to be involved with the whiskey that we're creating.
And what about geography? If you know that you might want to market a particular whiskey for Asia versus Europe versus the United States or South America, does that play into the potential flavor profile that you're thinking about?
It does, absolutely. So that would probably come down to the culinary differences and potentially how we're talking about the whiskey as well. If it is for a particular market, it might be that the language that we use is tailored more towards that market to make it more accessible in the place that it will most likely be sold and tried.
Right. So you wouldn't necessarily change Johnny Walker for Asia or South America, but the language that you might use to describe it might fit a different understanding of what that flavor palette is so that people can understand how it pairs with their lifestyle.
Yeah, and I think there's some whiskies that we produce that will be sold globally, and the language might be more consistent across the globe, whereas some whiskies that we create do just go into certain markets, and therefore that's the instance that we might be a bit more tailored in terms of the language that we're using as we're describing a whiskey.
So let's get back to Port Ellen. For my listeners, for a moment, I just want to start off this conversation by letting you know we're talking about luxury when we talk about Port Ellen whiskey. And doing a little bit of research, I came to find that in 2022, a rare cask of 1979 Port Ellen whiskey was auctioned by Sotheby's for 875,000 pounds, so almost $1 million, and was sold in a lot which included artwork in Murano glass by the artist designer Ini Archibong. It's not something you are going to find in your Sunday shop. You are not going to find it in your regular supermarkets per se. We're talking about a kind of whiskey that really is on the cutting edge of innovation and also comes from the 1800s, right? In its origins.
That's right. It has a fascinating history as Portel. So it's a malt distillery that's situated on the Isle of Islay, which is just on the west coast of Scotland. And it was established in 1825, as you just mentioned, by Alexander Mackay. And it was a person called John Ramsay that really took Portel forward and has become so associated with the distillery. He became the manager in 1836, and then he took over the lease in 1840. And it's had an interesting journey because actually we have just reopened Portel Distillery. It closed its doors in 1983, but that wasn't the first time that it closed its doors. This is actually the second time we have reopened the distillery. So it began its operations in 1825 and closed its doors in 1930. It reopened in 1967 and closed its doors, unfortunately, in 1983. That was around a time where, unfortunately, we're seeing quite a few of our distilleries closing their doors because of the whiskey industry at the time. But we announced in 2017 that actually we were looking to reopen Portel Distillery alongside Brora Distillery, which had a distillery that was in a similar situation. It closed its doors many years ago. And so Diageo has reinvested into Portel, and it's such a wonderful distillery, wonderful whiskies that are produced from this distillery. And it's been a privilege to be a part of the project team that have helped with the reopening of the distillery. So I mentioned it was announced in 2017, a long-awaited announcement, I might add. I think people have been waiting many years to hopefully see the doors of Portel reopening, and it's amazing to think that we're now in the position where we have done just that.
So let's get into it a little bit. What was fascinating to me about your background was your investigations into smoke and to Smoke DNAi. So walk us through a little bit about this process of coming out of the ether, as you call it at Diageo, and more about how AI and smoke are actually becoming part of the science behind the innovation in whiskey.
Yeah, so I'll explain a little bit around Portel and how it's constructed now, which will help to answer that question a little bit. So we're really fortunate. It's a really exciting opportunity that as we've reopened Portel Distillery, there's actually two sides to the distillery. We have the Phoenix side, which are two stills where we're looking to recreate the flavour style of Portel, the flavour style that would have been present in 1983 when the doors were closed. But then we also have the experimental side of the distillery as well. And this is where the world is our oyster in terms of experimentation going forward. We're in a period where we're looking to make sure that the quality of whiskies that we're producing at Portel are the best that they can possibly be. Portel is world renowned, it's world leading, it's built up such a fan base over the time, I guess because it closed its doors 40 years ago now, and the quality of the whiskies that we've been releasing since from these ghost whiskies have been amazing, and it's developed a following, and people have been looking to see what's coming next for Portel. And we're looking to make sure that the whiskies or the new mixed spirit that comes off of the stills before it goes into cask, we want that to be the best possible quality that it can be, to put us in the best position for the whiskies that we're creating for the future.
Mm.
But the experimental side of the distillery allows us the opportunity to play with different parameters within the production. And we're planning that at the moment to see what that will look like for the future. But the reason that we're doing that is because we want to understand more around the Atlas of Smoke. And by that, that's quite an interesting term, I suppose. When you think about Atlas, you think about journeys, you think about discovery, you think about exploration. And those are three great words to be able to describe really what we want to do with Portel. We want to get underneath the layers of flavour of the smoke. We want to understand more about how those compounds integrate, how they work together. And we hope that the experimental side of the distillery will allow us to do just that, essentially.
So what have you found so far of understanding, A, using machine learning in this process, right? And B, what have you uncovered so far about smoke that you didn't know before?
We're in the really early days, I suppose, for the distillery just now. We just reopened in March of this year. It was a privilege to be there as the doors were open to the public. But actually, we're starting that journey with our ghost whiskies, I suppose. And that brings us back to Out of the Ether and Smoke DNAi. We want to make sure that there's kind of a thread, some continuity from the old whiskies to the new whiskies that we'll be producing. And we've actually just released a new product, which was released at the same time as we reopened the doors to Portel, and that was Portel Gemini whiskey. And just to explain a little bit around that, so this is an amazing release for Portel. It's actually our oldest release to date, 44 years old. And this was actually a twin whiskey that was released. And the interesting thing about
Can
it
you
being a twin
explain that?
whiskey,
Yeah, I was going to say, can you explain that for
yeah.
folks who aren't regular? And I don't know how common a twin whiskey is to begin with. Frankly, that any innovation team is looking to set out and work with something that's 44 years old to begin with is in the space of this podcast and where most of our innovators on, it's a new piece of code that came out yesterday. Something that is 44 years old, and we're beginning to look at innovation models around it. Tell us about what does it mean to have a twin whiskey?
Yeah, so it's a really unique opportunity, particularly of a whiskey of this age, to have a twin offering. And what we mean by that is essentially it's two bottles in the overall display of Portel. But the interesting thing about these two bottles is that they actually share a commonality. They share some of the same DNA of Portel, and they've been on the same whiskey journey for a long period of time. So they started the maturation journey in 1978, and we've bottled it as a 44-year-old. But at a moment in time, in its early 40s, we decided to take these whiskies. Well, we blended 3 casks of 1978 Portel. These were European oak casks. And this vatting that was brought together was actually taken in 2 different directions. One side of the whiskies, this was actually put back into an original cask, so it would have continued its maturation journey like it was already on. But the other side of the whiskey was then put into what we called a remnant cask. And this has a really interesting story itself. The remnant cask would have been used, it was actually saved from Portel and it went to Lagavulin for a little while. And we were able to bring it back to the distillery when we heard that the reopening would be happening. And the idea of a remnant cask is that every production of Portel, when it was in operation until 1983, would have touched this cask because it was used as kind of a stock cask. It was used for the last part of every spirit run that was produced. That spirit would have been put into the cask until the next run, where it would have been put back into vat and then the process repeated. So we like to think that nearly every drop of Portel could have touched this cask. And there was actually a stencil on the side of the cask, which indicated the original contents of the cask as well. So we were able to recondition this cask with Williams and Humbert Walnut Brown Oloroso Sherry, which we believe to be the original contents of the cask, to kind of reinvigorate and condition this cask before the Portel was put back into it. And what this meant was we actually then had 2 journeys of maturation. We had the original cask, and then we had the remnant cask journey. And we were able to monitor the maturation effect of these 2 parallel journeys, whilst knowing that the DNA of the whiskies ultimately came from the same place.
Wow. And so how is it going? And how are your consumers? I mean, you have some pretty diehard fans when it comes to Port Ellen. whiskies. How are people responding to this two-sided flavor? I love how you called it Gemini, very horoscope, very new agey. But how are people responding to it? And what's the flavor profile? If you're going to describe it now as our chief describer on this show, how do you describe the difference in the two flavors?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting journey. We were able to take samples along the journey, along this maturation, to see how the flavour evolved and the impact that these casks were having. And we were actually able to then do analysis on these samples that had been taken as well. So we did analysis using high performance liquid chromatography, and we also did analysis with gas chromatography as well. Now, these are quite the results that you gain from these, I guess, are quite difficult to interpret, and they're not necessarily accessible to people outside of the laboratory space like we are. And therefore, we wanted to be able to do something to be able to make that easier to explain, easier to understand. And actually, we worked with partners at Bose Collins to be able to create a custom algorithm and to be able to interpret these data. And we taught the algorithm how to respond to the data, how the data should look upon its interpretation. And then a visual creation came out the back of that. So the custom algorithm is the Smoke DNAi that we mentioned a few moments ago. And the custom algorithm has helped to create this visualization. And it's a shame we're not able to display it just now, but it's a wonderful representation as to how the maturation has had an impact on the whiskies and how they've evolved over time. And you can see changes along the way. It's like a visualization to show the change over time as well. So you can pick out particular compounds and you can see the difference that these compounds have had through the maturation as well. It's quite fascinating for myself as a chemist to be able to show this and explain it to people. It's a wonderful way to bridge art and science, essentially. It's a way for them both to come together and give people a glimpse into the world of blending and maturation.
Yeah. And if you have the opportunity, listeners, to check out Diageo rareandexceptional.com, and you can do a search on Port Ellen, you'll find the Gemini whiskeys in their beautiful box. And I particularly like the monikers on the bottles that say, for the one that has pursued its regular journey, a giant awakens. And for its twin, it instead says that journey set in motion, right? So it's really fascinating to think about this as innovators when you begin to see the art and science of innovation coming together. So did you discover something new about these smoke profiles that, I mean, you're still uncovering? I imagine that the DNA of smoke is presenting itself to you that you intend to repurpose, reuse again in future batches?
Absolutely. I think this is the first step for us as Portel. Portel is a trailblazing distillery. It always has been. There's been a lot of innovation in the past, and we very much hope to take that innovation to the future. And we want to keep pushing the boundaries of experimentation. And the Smoke DNAi out of the ether, that feels like the first step for us to be able to do that just now. And this custom algorithm, as much as it currently is referring just to Portel and Gemini, it has so many possibilities for the future. We're able to use this algorithm now to understand and visualize different aspects of smoke. We provide the data, the information, and then we help with the interpretation of that and what it should look like. So I think it's a really exciting start point for us, and we'll see where the future of the DNAi takes us. But I'm looking forward to the experimentation that comes out of the distillery from the new make side, as well as the mature that we're already talking about. There's just so many different possibilities available to us at the moment. So it's wonderful to be part of this journey and this discovery with the technical teams.
Yeah. And what could come next? You know, I've had so many guests on the show after about 200 shows now, where we hear people from all different parts of science creating digital twins. To play off your twin metaphor here, where you can simultaneously in lab now begin to kind of move like a mixing board, right? You can begin to move the different levers of how we decide to design and create virtually anything by having this digital twin equivalent and available to us without necessarily disturbing the 44-year-old gold that lives in a cask somewhere. We could recreate it chemically and then begin to move things around. How much of that digital twinning is part of the desire to create this AI interface?
I think the important thing for our team is that it's a tool, a resource that can be used to help. showcase more around a whiskey. We don't feel that it will be something to replace the work that we're doing. The wonderful thing for us is that at the end of the day, a human nose is actually the greatest tool that we have available to us as blenders. The sensitivity that it has can't be replaced by an analytical tool at this stage. We can learn more through certain techniques. There's gas chromatography, which you can do an olfactory setting on, so you can actually put a sensor onto it so that you can understand flavors of particular compounds that are coming out throughout the run. You can do things like that, but ultimately it would never replace us doing a descriptive analysis of a whiskey, which is a wonderful thing for us in our team.
Yeah, and a whole lot more fun.
Absolutely. I would have to agree with you there.
Yeah, I mean, I see it happening in heavy manufacturing where people are using these digital twins to create different jet engines. Well, what if we started the fan here versus here? Just the ability to move things around that you wouldn't have the opportunity to do with, painfully heavy and very disruptive prototypes that you need to make over and over again, right? It's a shorthand, and certainly seeing lots of changes in the medical field that are creating digital twins of diseases and also healthy cells to watch those things interact on a computer screen rather than inside of a human body, and being able to begin to understand how those things play out. You can begin to watch the interplay of medicines and cells and go, oh, now I see how it could work. Or I could try out a new surgical procedure this way with a digital twin. But clearly the most fun part of it is actually in the tasting. So I'm also curious for my listeners, what are some of the challenges about innovating something that is so beloved and expected, let's say, to be a particular way? Where's the pushback that happens that can say we've maybe veered too far, or maybe this is out of the comfort zone, or maybe this will only be treasured by a very niche group of individuals who might love it, but I don't know if we can make this for widespread distribution. What are some of the challenges that you face as innovators to progress, let's say, or experimentation?
I think when we're looking at whiskies like Portel, because the ghost whiskies that we have are so rare and unique, they're on such a long maturation journey to the stage. I mentioned that Gemini has been released after 44 years. One of the big challenges is making sure that we protect the quality and the volume available to us of Portel so that we use it for its best and most desired use when we're creating a new whiskey. And we need to understand the ins and outs, the intricacies of the casks that we have of Portel to allow us to do this. Each of the whiskies at this stage, I like to think of whiskies as they get around 18, 20-year-old, up to 25 and beyond, they really start to have their own individuality, their own personality, so to speak. And therefore, it's making sure that we do the best thing for these whiskies with these personalities to make sure that we can bring all of these unique flavors to light to be able to share with consumers. Whether that's a flavor profile that consumers would expect of Portel, or whether we're able to push it into a new and interesting and different space. So I think the remnant cask is a great example of that because it does take it on quite a unique journey. We end up with flavor profile of it's very rich fruits, dried figs, prunes. There's a touch of dark chocolate in there. But there's also a level of savoury umami effect also, which is quite unique and unexpected perhaps for Portel, that isn't necessarily present in the original cask because of the different trajectories that both of these whiskies have taken. So it's making sure that we bring out the best and the greatest flavours of Portel and sharing them with the world.
So this show is all about the storytelling, and you've done a great job of taking us through really what are quite technological breakthroughs in the fields of whiskey. But is it challenging to get other people on board with the big idea inside of the organization? Where it's like, we really want to go in this direction, or were people surprised by this Gemini release as one of the first big ta-das of Portel?
I think a bit of both of those things, to be honest. I think Portel is trailblazing, and we wish to continue to be trailblazing as a distillery. And this is the first step for us to be able to do that. And I think it's a unique visualization that hasn't been done before for us or for anyone else, as far as I'm aware. Therefore, to be able to share that with people, I was fortunate enough to be able to take some people through that on opening week and to see their personal responses seen it for the first time, and to be able to explain a little bit more about the chemistry, the development of the technology that went into creating this visualization. It was wonderful to be a part of that, to kind of show a different side to the world of whiskey, and a side that will hopefully keep evolving as well, because it's something that we can keep learning from in time.
So my last question for you is, what is some advice that you might be able to give my listeners on how to really taste a whiskey in a way that's most effective? There's the endless with water, without water. There is the have it with my meal, after my meal, with a cigar, without a cigar, etc. What is the best way to taste whiskey? Not enjoy it, but really taste it, so we can begin to even visualize and begin to experience some of these flavors, primary or otherwise, that you're describing for us today.
Yeah, I think the way that we would taste whiskey in a lab setting is possibly quite different to how people consume it in their own homes. But in your own homes, I think being able to explore the world of flavour that's in the glass in front of you is the important thing. So having the time to be able to do that. I would recommend having a clean palate beforehand. So some ice cold water to sip on before you try your whiskey is always quite desirable. Helps to cleanse the palate. There we go, before we begin. And then taking I would have a nose of the whiskey to start with, just to warm up your senses, to get a good appreciation for it yourself. Have a nose, give it a swirl, have a nose. It's terminology that we use all of the time, but maybe that sounds quite strange outside of the lab. Have a nose. Once you've had a good nose to see the types of flavours that you might expect from the whiskey, I would then follow it with a taste. And to start with, I would take quite a small sip, just to coat the tongue, start to get an appreciation for the flavours that might start to evolve. But I would follow that with a second sip, which you would savour a little bit more. And through savouring that whiskey, you start to appreciate how the flavours evolve on your tongue. And whiskey is always a journey, in my opinion, whether you have it with water on the side, whether you have it with ice, whether you have it neat in the glass. Savour the moment, savour the time that you're spending with the whiskey to see all of those flavours emerge with time. And then go back to the whiskey to see whether it stays the same or whether it changes as it heats up, potentially, if you've got water in it, or if you've got ice in it. And really get to know that whiskey, get to understand where it's come from and the flavors that you're experiencing in front of you.
Yeah. Fantastic. I will say I had a miserable date with a gentleman who ordered a 12-year-old Oban Scotch with Coca-Cola and ice. There wasn't a second date. I can tell you that, Aimée, for sure.
Interesting. Well, we always say, as much as it might be difficult sometimes to appreciate some people's serves, we always say there's a whiskey out there for everybody if you find the flavour profile that you're looking for. And there's a serve out there for everybody as well. So no matter how you enjoy it, as long as you find the flavours that you enjoy, that's the best way to enjoy it.
I don't know how much flavor he was finding under that Coca-Cola, but I'll leave it there. Okay, so now I'm going to ask you the 3 questions I ask all of my guests who come on the Innovation Storyteller Show. What do you think is the greatest innovation of all time?
Yeah, probably skewed a little bit in the world of science and flavour and chemistry, but I think innovation within flavour chemistry is really powerful and really interesting. And I think the advancement of analytical techniques to detect impactful flavour chemistry and how flavour is understood is really quite fascinating. And I think advancement within chromatography and spectrometry, they've really allowed chemical progression and how we understand how flavour evolves as well. So back in 2012, there was actually a Nobel Prize awarded for chemistry, which was based on protein receptors and how cells react based on a stimulus. And I feel like this is the type of flavour chemistry that's fascinating, because it gives us an insight into how people experience the whiskies potentially that we're creating because of the flavours that they hold.
So this invention, this great innovation, greatest innovation of all time, is the ability to understand how we taste stuff. Is that what you're telling me?
Yes.
All
in
right.
a nutshell.
If it beats out the internet and AI and fire, got it. Okay. If you could join any innovation team through the course of human history, we are dispelling the myth of one innovator for all things, right? The Steve Jobs, the Bill Gates of the world, right? What is the innovation team you would have liked to have been on?
So I think it's really pertinent just now with the reopening of Portel back in March of this year. And I mentioned that Portel has opened a few times in the course of history.
Mm.
For me, as a whiskey blender, in the moment in my career that I am just now, I feel like the ability to have been part of one of those teams in the past, possibly the first team that was involved in the opening of Portel, would be a wonderful thing to behold, I suppose, because you'd be able to understand more about what Islay was like at the time, the island that Portel is based on, what the people were thinking as the distillery was open, the minds behind the distillery and why it was created in the way that it was, the shapes of the stills, all of the information that we have access to in our archive from the past of Portel, and we'd be able to understand the genesis of those decisions at the time. I think that would be really quite powerful as part of the Portel story looking to the future.
Yeah. And moving forward, what's something that really annoys you or something that you wish existed that has not been innovated or invented yet?
So I guess with my chemistry and maturation head on still, if there was a possibility of us understanding how the whiskies that we're laying down, or how the new make spirit that we're laying down today at Portel, how that would look and how it's evolved and how it's matured in, say, 40, 50 years' time, or even just into the future a little bit, so that we can understand the impact that we think we're going to have versus the impact that we are having, I think that would be a great place to be. So I guess ultimately, I'm requesting time travel. That hasn't been invented yet.
Yes, please. I would just like to get out of this election cycle here in the United States. That would be great. I would just like to teleport out of this and then come back. That would be fine. Aimée, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. If people want to get in touch with you, what is the best way for them to reach out?
So it's actually through the Diageo Rare and Exceptional page that you mentioned earlier on today. Any requests or queries that come through, they can be popped into there and then we'll be able to get back to people.
Fantastic. I strongly encourage you. The pictures are just phenomenal about Smoke DNAi and really beginning to understand how we're using machine learning to dissect some of these flavor profiles, and all the components that go into great whiskey making are on there. Really what's cutting edge in the world of whiskey. So thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be involved. Thank you very much.